away.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so hello everyone, thanks for joining today. As I'll say again, my name's Stuart Nicholson, as it says on the screen, and I'm a lecturer in computer science. Again, not knowing who my audience would be today, but I've been here at the university since, I think, December 2019, so not too long in the grand scheme of things. Broadly speaking, my research focuses on how digital technology can help resource-constrained communities, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about what that actually means, or rather what it means to me anyway. So starting with a little bit of background first, a lot of the motivation for my work comes from the shift in thinking that experts are not always the people who work in industry, or for example in universities. You know, the sort of the old image that the universities are the ivory tower of knowledge. So within human-computer interaction, this has been the case for quite a while now, and this is quite widely understood. But it has influenced to a certain degree about how I go about engaging stakeholders, or rather just people in general. Okay, this sort of shift in treating people as experts as opposed to people in the industry who have the knowledge and the power. So as I mentioned, a lot of this understanding has already existed in HCI for a long time now. The need to engage with people around real problems and try and design workable digital solutions with them in some cases. Now, my work also draws on something called digital civics. I'm not sure if anybody here will be aware of what digital civics is. It's a sort of a term that was coined from sort of Newcastle University, Patrick Olivier, if anyone knows him, which is, broadly speaking, the activity of theorizing, designing, developing, and evaluating personal community-based digital technologies to explore and create forms of civic engagement to support local communities, local service provision, and local democracy. Okay, so a lot of my work is kind of grounded in this kind of understanding, being that I was originally at Newcastle. I went through the CDT in digital civics. My master's, or one of my masters, is a master's in research in digital civics. I thought I probably better drop that in there as a bit of background because it's quite relevant. So why have I mentioned this? Why does it matter? Well, if you think about how this affect, if you think about the effects of austerity hit in what, 2009, 2010, around that sort of time. But the effects of this are still very much with us today. And again, it's make a little bit more sense when I sort of go on to talking about my own work. So especially if you look at sort of local government, councils, the police, NHS, for example, you can see that, especially when austerity hit back then, there was a big shift in taking away from the face-to-face traditional services that were then kind of replaced with predominantly digital services or digital processes as a cost-saving measure. A lot of these services were turned purely digital, again, partly because they had to save money. But then over time, again, we're in what, 2021 now. But when this work, or when I started doing this sort of stuff, it was sort of 2015, 2016. A lot of these services were starting to come back in a kind of a hybrid way, where you had, they were starting to introduce sort of, people back into roles that had been originally abolished. But there was still this sort of emphasis on, okay, we need to maintain a digital presence because we never had it before, but we don't want to be fully digital. So there was sort of these weird hybrids sort of coming about. And what, again, NGOs, sort of non-profit organizations, local government, police, etc., were all kind of discovering at the time that, well, that they're maybe not the best people or the best well placed to actually come up with these sort of hybrid solutions, to actually see how digital solutions can work in harmony with people, so people can actually go through these processes and actually have some element of satisfaction at the end, or some sort of element of actually going through it and actually be happy with the service that they've received. This makes it a little bit more relevant to some of my later case studies, which I'll go into in a minute. But this is kind of the background for how some of my work and where it sits. Okay, It's very well, it's very motivated by austerity, and again, cutbacks and how that affected NGOs and the public sector, which I'll go into now. So when I say resource constrained communities, what exactly do I mean? What am I talking about? Well, if you think of a resource constrained community as, for example, it could be a group of Syrian refugees, it could be a group of disabled DIY makers, or less obviously, it could simply be young people. Okay, people who live in a particular neighborhood. For example, it could be a neighborhood of like high social deprivation or something like that. For me, in my research, I initially began working with rural communities. Rural communities are someone who were affected essentially by austerity. They are just generally, in the grand scheme of things, a very resource constrained, subset, of the population, just by where they sit geographically. But as part of that, I was engaging with NGOs, nonprofit organizations, to tackle problems of rural-urban flight. This concept of young people in rural areas essentially wanting or needing or almost being forced out of rural areas to go to more urban areas. So, for example, all of this work is sort of situated in the northeast that I've done so far. And those sort of more urban locations would have been like Berwick upon Tweed, Newcastle upon Tyne, and maybe a little bit further down, going to like Darlington and going to Durham and places like that as well. Now, I'll go into these in more detail in the next slides, but after that, the work sort of opportunistically moved into the world of policing, where I found myself in a really strange situation where I was an active police officer while doing a PhD. If anyone ever is even tempted to do that, I don't recommend it. I think it was a terrible idea. But here I am now. It seems to have paid off. But yeah, pretty difficult. But I say this was actually, I say opportunistically, I use that word, that is the correct word to use, because I was in that role and I found that I could actually, benefit the police in such a way, by integrating some of my research here, integrating some sort of the digital civicsness, if you like. Because it allowed working in the police gave me a really firm understanding of how police as an organization operate, the problems that they have, and also how they, again, because of austerity and a little bit of the background there, of, how they themselves are resource constrained, okay, as well as the communities that they are trying to serve in some instances, for example, social deprivation, socially deprived neighborhoods, also resource constrained. So both rural communities, their NGOs, and the support from local government, police, and all the austerity that had affected them as well. This justified the work that was being done to try and help it justified the work that I was going to be doing with them, with how digital technology could be integrated, but the need for how it had to be carefully designed, again, with a lot of the emphasis here on, okay, how can we put solutions in place to tackle their problems, these real problems that they have, but with, sort of long-term impact. And I say impact, I actually just mean solutions that are going to still be working once the researcher, once the quote unquote expert has left, okay? So when effectively, as I've now departed from the Northeast, are these, can these solutions operate themselves? Can they operate independently without experts getting involved? So the first major piece of work that I did was with Glendale Gateway Trust, and this was in 2015. And this is an ongoing project. Okay, so it's what, coming on for 6 up to 7 years now. Glendale Gateway Trust is a small NGO based in Northumberland. Northumberland, for anyone who doesn't know it, a huge sort of 250 square mile expanse just north of Newcastle upon Tyne. In this particular sort of project, we used pervasive displays. So pervasive displays, essentially, I say pervasive displays, I'll say network displays, a series of really low cost technology that was put together on a bit of a sort of shoestring budget using sort of DIY off-the-shelf technology, Raspberry Pis. We even got monitors from like Newcastle University from the e-waste, again, with sustainability in mind here for the NGO who didn't have a lot of money to try and implement a solution to try and overcome rural urban flight, this transition of young people moving away to the bigger cities, neighboring bigger cities. So this was just one of many different solutions or projects, you like, that the trust was trying. I was involved in this one, and they were trying to, well, basically trying to make young people more aware of the opportunities more in a more localized context. And because a lot of support that would have been Northumberland County Council, as a sort of the public sector here, had removed because of austerity. Okay. And again, it was a little bit of a homebrew solution, but again, it was a solution to a real problem that they had at the time. Yeah, this is just a little bit of context for you if you're not really sure where Northumberland was. Again, not really sure who the audience would be today, but I'm sure Bertie knows. It's not too far from where he was once before. So, what this ended up being is we had two different sort of display networks, which was quite unique in itself. If anyone's familiar with work by like Nick Taylor, I think a lot of the work he did in his PhD also sort of got publications from it as well, tended to be 1 to, I want to say possibly 3, but I don't think it was that big, these network of displays. The displays I had, these networks in different places, one centered in and around Wooler of 9 displays, and one in Rothbury as well. Public information displays, lots of different individual displays, TVs, computer monitors, however you want to frame them, in public locations as a public service sort of announcement area. Interestingly, there was I just published a Chi paper on this finally. So if you're interested in reading that, ping me a message and I can send you a copy, or you could just look it up. I think it's probably all online now. So as I mentioned as well, I'm just sort of going through the transition here. This opportunistically moved onto working with the police, specifically Northumbria Police, who have for a long time had a very big problem with engaging their more socially deprived areas. Okay, actually doing sort of neighborhood policing in socially deprived areas. There's a complete disengagement historically. I mean, it's not around the UK, socially deprived neighborhoods really are not that interested in engaging with the police, generally speaking. Partly because the police themselves have a lot of out-of-date techniques. Okay, they normally use something called PACT, P-A-C-T, which is police and communities together, which is a very outdated technique now, which is more than 30 years old or so, something like that. And it just hasn't really kept up to date with the times, and especially now in sort of a modern era where essentially everything is sort of digitized to some extent. It really doesn't match up. So what we would do, or what I was doing in this context here, is actually, as a police officer as well, I had this really unique insight into the police of working inside as an internal member of the organization. But also this other hat that I would put on, which was, I'm a PhD student, I'm doing HCI. So I actually, we sort of came up with the idea, well, why don't we try and leverage some of the design methodologies that we apply in HCI, internally to the police, so we can actually almost have put in place an intervention to actually say, well, look, you're doing community engagement like this at the minute. It's not effective. It's proved that it's not effective. There's many different articles about that, and just general day-to-day practice, people are just very unhappy with it. So why don't we actually try and come up with a new way of engaging these communities so that you can actually, again, benefits the police in their sort of community, in their relationship, building up rapport and trust with communities. Why don't we come up with a new way of doing that? So we came up with this technique of just using a sort of slightly modified World Cafe approach, a very informal approach for police, in essence, who would go into the community. They wouldn't be wearing their uniform. And again, it was something for them it sort of blew their mind a little bit, something that they're not really used to. But it was supported as well by the digital aspect, an online training platform, which we integrated with Northumbria Police. And something, again, I mean, this was done in 2018, 2019. It's now become a staple piece of Northumbria Police's neighborhood policing training material. Yeah, if you were to join Northumbria Police as a police officer, this is training that you would be giving almost as mandatory as part of the core modules. So that was sort of like the second case study that I did here. And again, we're thinking about the police as a resource-constrained community. They didn't actually have the funds or really the knowledge themselves to actually do this, do it themselves. They've been hit really hard by austerity. And, if you think about the police as a traditional sort of pillar civic institution, as far as I can see, they don't necessarily have the scope as well. If you think, it's a very hierarchical institution. People in the police don't necessarily have the scope to innovate inside these such strict boundaries. So that was a really interesting sort of case study that I had there as well. Anyway, what is this all sort of coming to? What was I actually interested in as I was going through these projects? Well, as I said, they're both still ongoing. They're sort of almost like long ethnographic work, in a certain extent. I do revisit them from time to time, as I do want to keep, going back to see how things have played out. Again, because I've got this this overall view of how technology should or can be configured for sustainability, so that it can actually run independently. These sort of these socio-technical systems, which I've essentially implemented. So as part of this sort of overarching theme of designing for sustainability, I also wanted to take account of governance. Okay, so governance is looking at essentially the background work, the actual sort of, it is the background works that takes place as part of all these sort of interventions and all these different projects, all the different actors involved. Again, it's actually coming up with solutions and that really take account of the people, the technology, the different resources to actually put all these things together. But also how these all these systems can actually be made so that they are transferable and that they are scalable. Okay, so that if we were to take, for example, this kind of like idea, this framework of like a police training package, so that it could be applied to different areas as well. And that is part of some of the future work that I'm looking into, which I'll go into next. Designing for adoption, what are the sort of the best practices here and how we can actually distribute out, distribute out the governance, for example, not relying on, for example, like community champions, as Nick Taylor would have sort of phrased it, the key people in these communities, who are the people that always get work offloaded on them because they're seen as like the more capable people or the people with the most expertise. Designing for adoption, we're trying to sort of remove that necessity to actually put more work on those people and distribute it out just amongst normal people in the community, normal people, basically. And again, all these sort of considerations in terms of what I'm actually getting to is actually for designing these sort of socio-technical systems for sustainability. And it's actually more now pointing at actually designing for capability instead. That is kind of what we're getting to. This is the actual interesting part now, is that we actually shouldn't necessarily be designing to sort of inject these resources so that there are these people in place, but it's actually also taking account of capability. So where am I at now? Well, it's despite the COVID break, I mean, we've had we all had to sort of stop research for a little bit, and again, a lot of this work that I've done, I had to take a break from it because other things sort of took time, when COVID hit. But where are we at the minute? A lot of this work that I've done was based in the Northeast, and essentially what I'm trying to do now is actually sort of network that down to where we are now in Swansea, in Wales. So I'm still looking to continue work with rural communities in Wales. Again, not really specified yet as to which rural communities yet, but looking at essentially working with similar kind of NGOs in similar situations, but with sort of more modern or more present problems such as learning, remote learning through the sort of the learning hubs that exist in rural communities at the minute. But the one that is actually really exciting, which has got a little bit more legs to it at the minute, is continuing work with the police. So I've been working again with Northumbria Police for a number of years as well. But the idea is that I'm working with South Wales Police, again, continuing collaboration with them to actually, essentially bolster this training package that's been developed, make it into something which is going to be a little bit more substantial, which could go, you're thinking of something that could maybe get hosted on something like a platform like FutureLearn or something like that, a template training package that police officers can go through and be applied essentially as a sort of training material throughout the United Kingdom, so it can be integrated as a staple part of neighbourhood policing. That's where these projects are sort of leading to, and I'm hoping to sort of continue them down here to a certain extent. And again, just a little note, thanks to Cherish for the secondments. They were very helpful in actually sort of re-engaging with some of my existing partners, but also branching out to new partners as well. Especially down here in Swansea, in South Wales, where again, with COVID, it was quite hard, but again, I've still tried to find new people to collaborate with. So that's what I've done. That's hopefully kind of what I'm interested in, what I'm sort of focusing on, what I'm doing now, and I hope that's given you a very rough overview. Again, I put this together fairly quickly, but hopefully it's given you a good overview of roughly what I'm doing at the minute. Thank you very much.